Hey church family, happy Friday. Sitting in the big room with the big fireplace today because the recording studio is doing some recording right below my desk right now, and I didn't necessarily want that as the background music for the video today. But happy Friday. Glad to be able to be with you, even if it's just on a video. I hope that many of you are going to be able to join us on the Zoom call later today for the Tenebrae service as we have opportunity to reflect on the suffering of Jesus on our behalf. So I hope you're able to do that tonight at 7. But today I wanted to actually spend a little bit of time talking with you guys about some of the things that I've had the privilege of talking with a number of you about over the course of the last few weeks, and that's the problem of suffering or the problem of evil. And just at the outset, I want to say, I know in a short video I'm not going to be able to solve it. There are countless books that have been written that haven't solved the issue. And I'm not going to be able to address all the issues, but I want to be able to speak to some of them. Because even as we were starting this video series last week, remember that one of the things we had talked about and what we committed to is that every week when we're doing these videos on Friday, we're going to be talking about the 3 loves of a disciple. Our upward love, our love for God, our inward love, our love for one another as followers of Jesus, and then our outward love, our love for those that are near to us but are far from God. And I think that the problem of evil, the problem of suffering in the world can actually be a wedge in regard to all 3 of those loves. It can keep us from growing in our love with God. It can keep us from fellowship with one another. And then it can also certainly drive a wedge in relationship with other people, especially in conversations. And again, at the outset here, I want to just say that the problem of suffering, the problem of evil is never just an abstract philosophical concept. It's always emotional and it's always personal. An example of that, when I was in seminary, I worked at a running store in Beverly, and one of my coworkers, the first day that I started working and she found out that I was studying to be a pastor, she came up and she said, "If there's a good God and you believe in him, how could he let my dad die when I was 17? That's a legit question. It's an honest question. And in moments like that, we have to think about how we're going to respond. And I just want to address some of the things that I've learned, whether it be because I've made bad decisions in the past and put my foot in my mouth, maybe you have too, or some of the things that, again, I just think the Bible gives us as a resource in those moments. And the first thing that I just want to say is that we need to be sensitive. It should go without saying, but to be quite honest, I think that there are a lot of moments that we're not. When my friend asked me that question, I needed to listen, and I needed to start asking questions. Tell me more about that. I wanted to get to know more of her story so that I could better understand her framework for who God was, but also just her family story. Because again, it came from a place of personal experience. It was an emotional reality for her, and I wanted to be sensitive to that. And the Bible gives us a resource for this. We don't have to give an answer in that moment. Jesus said very simply, mourn with those who mourn. Sometimes that's the most appropriate response that we can give, even when people ask that question. And to be quite honest, most of the time they're not really looking for an answer. You can have a lot of long, lengthy conversations with people about that over the course of time. But what they want to know is, are you with me in the midst of this? And again, Jesus said, mourn with those who mourn. We have a resource for that, so be sensitive. But then secondly, be honest. One of the things that I mean here is that we have to be careful of just giving well-intentioned, true, but sterile theological answers. When people ask us that question, how could a good God allow evil and suffering in the world? That's probably not the moment to drop Romans 8:28 on them. It's probably not the moment to drop Genesis 50 verse 20 on them. Those verses are true. Yes, it's true that God works all things together for those who love him and are called according to his purposes. It's true that what humans plan for evil, God can work for good. That's the verse back there in Genesis 50 verse 20. But those aren't the moments when they're asking that question that we necessarily need to give those responses. But also, even when you do give those responses, be honest in the sense that that's not the only answer. Sometimes the way that we seek to portray or respond with those answers is as if those were the answers, capital T, capital H, capital E. Those are just part of the responses. The Bible tells a much bigger story. And one of the things that we have to be honest about in the midst of this is that those things are not the only answer. And they may not be the things that we actually need to point to in those moments. So again, be sensitive, be honest. And part of this honesty is that just we can even say, you know what, that's a great question. And I don't think the Bible actually seeks to give the answer to that. What the Bible seems to do is give a number of answers to that, or a number better of responses to that. But what the Bible does best is it gives space. The Bible gives resource and it gives space. Think about the fact that in Job's story, he asks the question in Job 2, and there's not a response given until chapter 38. Job is given space. He's given space to protest. He's given space to complain. He's given space to lament. 70 of the Psalms, we talked about this a couple weeks ago when we looked at Psalm 22. 70 of the Psalms are given to the reality of lament. There's an entire book of the Bible called Lamentations. We don't do a good job of complaining. We forget that the Bible gives us resource. The Bible invites the question. The Bible invites the dialogue. The Bible invites the prayer. The Bible even gives us language to ask the question. That's something that I think we need to tell people when they're asking that question. Hey, how much of the Bible have you read? Have you ever looked at some of the lament psalms where some of the psalmists ask that same question? There's a resource there. And I think that a lot of times we forget that. The Bible is real. The Bible allows that. It invites that. It gives us language. What I think the Bible does when we begin to see that it allows for those things and it gives us that language, the Bible gives us companionship in that moment. And that's something that we need to be honest about. Be sensitive, be honest, but be thoughtful as well. One of the things that we talked about again a couple weeks ago when we were looking at Psalm 22, but when you're having those conversations with people who in essence are thinking about rubbing up against and bumping up against, being confronted with the reality of pain and suffering, and yet wanting to, at some level, believe in a good God, a God that exists, or maybe they're trying to use that again as an excuse for why they don't believe, or an obstacle as to why they don't believe. I want to just point to 3 quotes when you're in those conversations that I want you to think about. You probably won't remember the quotes, but think about this when you're thinking about how to be thoughtful. Part of this is going to get to the idea of how are you going to ask good questions, even of yourself. If you begin to waver in your own faith, and there are going to be moments where that's a reality. You see that in the Psalms too, so don't be afraid of that. Allow yourself to think about some of those questions in a deep way. And here are 3 quotes that I want to point to. The first is actually from a really thoughtful atheist named Stephen Crane. He had a horrendous experience where he was in a plane crash. He was wrecked at sea for a number of days and finally was saved. But this was some of his reflection after that experience when he was thinking about the fact that he believed in just a closed universe, that God didn't exist at all. And this is what he wrote. He said, "When it occurs to a man that nature does not regard him as important, and that she feels she would not maim the universe by disposing of him, that man at first wishes to throw bricks at the temple, and then he hates deeply the fact that there are no bricks because there is no temple." What Stephen Crane is in essence saying is he's following his philosophy, his worldview, to its logical conclusion. He says, there's no brick. I can't be angry because there's no God. There's no temple. So in essence, what he's saying is that nature is morally different. If all there is a natural world, nature is morally indifferent to us. It's natural. Those are the things that happen. So what is unnatural is my response. How might that begin to help us think, or to help us dialogue in the midst of those moments in conversation with others? Another quote was one that I used a couple weeks ago from C.S. Lewis. He says, in a sense, Christianity creates rather than solves the problem of pain. For pain would be no problem unless, side by side with our daily experience of this painful world, we had received what we think is good assurance of an ultimate reality that is righteous and loving. In other words, for C.S. Lewis, there are bricks because there is a temple. I can complain because there is a God, and I believe that he's just. I've heard and had experience of his justice and his righteousness and his goodness and his power in the past. Another quote from Dick Keyes, the problem of evil is only a problem for the Christian or any theist who believes God to be powerful and good. If there's no good God and the universe is all that exists, what's the ground for the complaint? All three of those quotes are thoughtful quotes. The question that we're really wrestling with here is, where does our expectation for life, for goodness, for righteousness, justice, healing, where does that expectation come from? See, the problem of suffering seems to be more of a pointer to the existence of a God than it is his non-existence. If he doesn't exist, we have no reason to complain. The problem is actually internal. The problem is with me. So we can be sensitive. We can be honest. We can be thoughtful. But then finally, how can we be redemptive? Here's what I mean by that. When someone asks, why would a good and all-powerful God allow suffering? One of the questions that it would be good for us to figure out how to pose to ourselves, to other people, is, why do you suspect that that same God, who is all-powerful and is good, why do you suspect that that same God would willingly subject himself to the suffering, injustice, and evil of this world in order to save it? See, the point there is that God is not a stranger to the problem of evil. God is not removed from it. He's not indifferent from it. Again, listen to another quote from Dick Keyes. He says, God has not simply allowed suffering to be part of this world order. He has himself entered into our suffering in an extreme way, not only as a gesture of solidarity with us, but also as a means of eventually breaking the power of suffering and evil over us. Whatever reason God has for allowing suffering and evil to continue in this world, the crucifixion proves that it is not because God is indifferent to the human race. I cannot answer the first question. Why would a good God allow suffering? I can't answer that fully. I don't think the Bible seeks to give an answer to that fully. But what I can answer when I ask the second question, why would that same God allow himself willingly to endure suffering and evil and injustice? I can answer that question. And it is not because God is indifferent to our suffering. It's because God loves us in it. And God wants to rescue us from it. So part of being redemptive is pointing to the cross as Jesus' identity with us in our suffering. And then also part of being redemptive is pointing to the good ending. J.R. Tolkien once wrote that God is making all the sad things come untrue. That's the end of the story. That's the commitment that God has made. And in order to do that, in order to make all of the sad things come untrue, God had to take upon himself the pain and the suffering and the injustice of all of the sad things that we ourselves have engaged in. God is utterly committed to renewing all things, so committed to it that he entered into and took upon himself our pain and our suffering. So we need to figure out a way to be redemptive, because God is not a stranger to the problem of evil. He experienced it himself. And we need to show people God's good ending as we're seeking to be redemptive. So a few concluding thoughts. When grief or pain is being experienced by somebody else, That is not the moment for an airtight theological answer. It's the time to mourn with those who mourn. Be sensitive. The second, think about what you're sharing. Be honest. Give people space. Point them to the resource that is the Bible in all of those laments. Be honest. Be thoughtful. Third, think about how this reality of the problem of evil actually seems to demonstrate the reality of God's existence, because there's something hardwired within us that longs for goodness, longs for justice, cries out for it. But if we live in a naturally closed world, there are no bricks because there's no temple. And then finally, be redemptive. Remind people of the cross. Remind people of God's good ending. Speak fully of God's good plan for his world. After all, he has staked his life upon renewing it. Again, I know we didn't cover all the details. There's plenty more that we could talk about in the midst of that. But I want to encourage you, as you're thinking through this, as you're processing through this yourself or with others, consider those things. Be sensitive. Be honest. Be thoughtful. And be redemptive. I look forward to seeing you tonight, even as we think about and reflect on Jesus' suffering for us as his people. Hope to see you tonight. Take care.